This is special programming from WBRN Radio and the Boston Red Network. The Minnesota gubernatorial debate, I believe there will be two of these debates at least. This is between the Democratic and Republican candidate for governor in the state of Minnesota. Part of our series on the Rust Belt, we'll be having a number of states here. Indiana will be, of course, coming up soon as we look more at the Rust Belt. That would be a debate between the current senator in the state of Indiana, Donnelly, and his opponent. Now, this particular race here in Minnesota, Johnson and Walz. Johnson has ran for governor before. Get it a little right here. And he, of course, lost against the present governor, Mark Dayton. Now he's running a second time around, this time against Walz, who is currently a Congress type from the southern part of Minnesota, or what is termed there Greater Minnesota, and this is the Greater Minnesota debate, which we have coming now. So what we are doing here at WBRN is presenting a number of debates around the country and in various areas. Now, this debate is or was live on the radio station WCCO in Oklahoma. I'm thinking of these Clear Channel stations in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I used to hear, when I lived out west, I used to hear the Clear Channel stations. There were a number of them around at that time. In WCCO, we could get it live out there. Nonetheless, this is it was an audio debate. Some comments here from the two, and you'll see this kind of a theme in some of the debates, particularly gubernatorial, Senate, and House debates. Starting here with a quote from Johnson: "Your voting record is quite liberal." Walz: "I would ask Johnson, would you have voted with Nancy Pelosi to improve veteran suicide care?" Nancy Pelosi has become a issue in many of these races, particularly in the races in red areas. This particular district here in southern Minnesota had voted for Barack Obama twice, and in 2016 it voted for DJ Trump. 200 people were there, and the two took topics ranging from farming, it's a farming area, transportation, healthcare. At the start, healthcare, incidentally, has become a very big issue in this race. I think our personalities are actually pretty similar. That's from Johnson, the Republican. "Your voting record is quite liberal." You were with Nancy Pelosi, and he's also bringing in Keith Ellison, who is running for Attorney General. Over 90% of the time, I think it is 94%. This suggests that you are one of the more bipartisan people there. The bar is pretty low. Walz accused Johnson of unfair criticism and trying to divide voters by pulling out his voting record. That's pretty standard procedure. I would ask Jeff, would you have voted with, now we already did that, to improve the GI Bill. This is with Nancy Pelosi. Would you have voted on many of those things that all of you would have agreed with? And this is what is wrong with our system. Johnson then accused Walz of taking far left a stance on a variety of topics, to which Walz repeated, "You need to change to adapt transportation." One of the big areas out in what they call Greater Minnesota. This backlog is continuing to grow, so I think you need to have an honest conversation with the citizens of Minnesota who pay for things that they know improve this country. That's from Representative Walz. Walz referred his proposal to increase local government back to 2002 levels at one time to better fund projects in Greater Minnesota. He said that the approach would strengthen local decision making, and the decrease in local government has left many municipalities to raise funds to make up the difference. So in other words, this was state funding of local governments. Jeff is saying he knows better than the leaders in our metropolitan areas how to make some of these decisions as governor. My job is to build coalitions, and this is something you'll hear throughout the debate. Walz is talking about a coalition building. To talk about those things, we'll be very clear about. We will be very clear about this. The property tax shift that happened because of local government aid still falls upon you. Johnson is opposed to raising the gas tax, a gasoline tax, and said Minnesota is one of the highest tax states in America. One of the panelists, Ellison, then asked Johnson how he plans to pay for his road projects without any new revenue. I don't believe we need new taxes, Johnson said. I do believe, however, that if we spend a little bit of the money from the general fund for transportation, for roads and bridges, maybe even a bus system, it wouldn't be a bad thing. And we'll get to health care here. Walz has said in the past that he supports a single payer. Now, this is what Walz had to say about it. The only way to bring costs down in the long run is to understand what's driving up costs in the first place. That's from Representative Walz. I challenge all of you to tell me what it costs to fix a broken arm, and there is no market, there is no price transparency. Several times Johnson asked Walz to be clear with the voters whether he would push of a single payer program if elected. I've said again, and I don't necessarily care what it looks like, but payer price, the payer piece, is going to impact the results of individuals getting health care and making sure we are compensating that. Now, Johnson said, well, single payer means you'll no longer be a private insurance for the people of Minnesota. That is an absolute lie. That has been said a number of times. Bernie Sanders and a number of other people are pushing what they term Medicare for all. A little different from single payer, but it's on that route. In other words, people would be taxed as you are for your FICA, your Social Security tax, etc. Medicare tax would be out of your income, and you'd pay maybe 1.5% to that fund, the same as under the FICA regime that unemployment compensation, these programs come out. What would change is the current Affordable Care Act would, of course, be modified, and you would have things like Medicaid that you have now. Those would be changed over and into this general fund. So you would not have to have a state federal partnership for Medicaid. And actually, the end result now, in most of these programs, all of these programs, is same with the Affordable Care Act. Your upfront cost is going to be much more because you are treating people that have not been treated before. You're switching to a prevention model. And that is the way that the healthcare industry is going. There was a comment by one of the major healthcare operations in Minnesota, the Blue Cross people, that they want to move to a preventive care agency rather than paying a claims agency. They want to be a health wellness agency. Now that is a different concept when you talk about health wellness, because you're talking about a holistic approach, and that is the way it is going. Now the individual insurance marketplaces, carriers is different. There, the costs have went up and up, no doubt about it, and is changing constantly. So basically, this was the backbone of the debate. Let me just look from an AP story here. This is from the local Metro newspaper, the Star Tribune, out of Minneapolis. Johnson and Walz face off in a greater Minnesota debate. Two major candidates face off. Now, they didn't have a third-party candidate in here. This Johnson is a commissioner in Hennepin County. Greater Minnesota will get one of their own to lead the state government for the next 4 years. Now, Walz is from Greater Minnesota, a place called Mankato. He represents the 1st Congressional District, which cuts across southern Minnesota from Wisconsin to the borders of those states and South Dakota. He represents the Mayo Clinic area there. Johnson is also from rural Minnesota, a farming community and resort community east of Fargo, Minnesota. Fargo, North Dakota, I suppose. You can't promise. Well, anyway, we won't get into promises here, but these go into each and every campaign. Here, Walz offers an ambitious vision for the state. I'm not interested in making Minnesota a mediocre state, period. This means that we need to work together for a world-class education system across and to access affordable health care, to build a healthy transportation system. Now, Walz, the paper goes on to say, his home is in southern Minnesota. I've had to work hard to win over Greater Minnesota, where Republicans have had steady march, especially since 2014. They have flipped the Minnesota House, mostly by turning rural districts red. Greater Minnesota communities face complex set of policy challenges, no doubt about that, and more challenges. Incidentally, the tariffs, they do talk a little bit about that. The tariffs do affect Greater Minnesota, and Trump's answer to the farmers is a bailout program, which most Republicans would have resisted, period. Now, broadband internet, a very big problem in Greater Minnesota. More aid from state government to cities and townships to keep property taxes down. Of course, that costs money. This is one of the states that when Tim Hu Pawlenty, incidentally, he opposed Johnson in the primary and lost. He was the establishment Republican. And DJ Trump has been to southern Minnesota, period. Now, businesses are short workers all over the place. This is from a Republican down in Greater Minnesota. Communities are asking lawmakers and the next governor to figure out how to solve housing and child care shortages. Now, some of these are faced all over the place. As for agro land, however, the bottom line are really tight. The Corn Growers Association comes in here. Farmers face low prices. The prospect of ongoing trade war with China has destroyed profits. And it'll be interesting to see how farmers vote in this particular election, because the tariffs are killing them, and the ongoing trade war, which will not end anytime soon. And as someone brought up in this debate while we listened to it, that basically if you lose customers, you may actually never get them back, period. Now, one of the features of a Walz administration would be to allow people to vote into something. And various states have various names. In Wisconsin, I believe it's Badger Care. In Minnesota, it was Minnesota Care. The people, the general public, to buy into it at this present time, only people at a certain degree of the poverty line can buy into it, period. And let me finish this up. There's a comment here from somebody named Bob Harper, a bartender who's trying to break into it in the wrong time because a real estate business demurred about his political leanings, not wanting to offer offend potential clients. He said the tense political atmosphere can easily be found outside of the metro. Well, his problem is going to be with interest rates going up, and they're continuing to go up. Now, this debate was held on, what was it, Monday, I believe, on Monday. So we didn't have reaction to the stock market falling both days, and that is a little different. This is on the 9th of October. We are posting this on the 12th of October under a general situation. Incidentally, Keith Ellison is running for Attorney General of Minnesota. He also ran for the chair of the Democratic Party. He's a progressive Congress type that is effectively retiring from Congress out of the Twin Cities. And also he's an African American. He's been hit by a domestic violence allegation. And the allegation is up in the air because there supposedly was a smartphone video of it that the woman in question, a former girlfriend of his, will not release. And the debate is, will it be released or will it not be released? Period. It calls for investigations and various investigators, including the local police there in Minneapolis. But they do not want the case. So that is something on the voters' minds as we go in closer to this election. Let me just finish this piece up because this is a 90-minute debate. We did not edit it out. But there is an interesting article on Friday Jobber, that is our political magazine program. On Friday morning, we'll talk more about this particular situation. This is an op-ed by Thomas Ezel, I guess I pronounce his name. Is the Rust Belt still a country, Trump country? He asked. The Democrats are leading in many high-profile races, no doubt about that. Democrats lead in major statewide races in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, and Wisconsin. Now, these are different states. Ohio, you have Cadre, who used to be at the Consumer Finance Bureau, and he was at one time the Attorney General of Ohio. So that is a little bit different. Along with Minnesota, Indiana, and Illinois, a total of 13 governorships and Senate contests will be out on Election Day. Now, it's difficult to overestimate the political importance of the Midwest. The region was not only critical to Trump's victory, it has been critical to continuing conservative control of both branches of Congress. And this at one time was in overall a Democratic area, particularly Michigan and being the UAW there. Now it's a right-to-work state. Matt Grossman, he's a political science at Michigan State, said interpreting the 2016 election as a beginning of a possible realignment of the Great Lakes Midwest, with the working class leaving the Democrats. But this year, Senate races in those states not even competitive for the Republicans. Well, that was a temporary thing there. And from Nate Silver, by far the Democrats' strongest region in the Senate, governors, and House polling has been the Midwest. I don't think you really gather that from the totality of reporting, which tends to be fixate on demographic changes and therefore finds races in the South and West a lot more sexy. Well, no doubt about that. According to both Democrats and Republican operatives, Republicans' difficulty in the region stem in part from trends among many Obama 2012 to Trump voters switching back to being Democrats. Well, they moved from one party to the next party. There's no doubt about that. And from Cylinder Lake, a Democratic poster. I don't think she's a very good poster. Just my particular comment agrees with. While in 2018, Trump's victories in the Midwest are not going to pay off. Democrats should be more wary of 2012. In the Midwest and nationally, Republicans, especially Trump, are ahead on the economy and trade. Now, this is where she didn't think in terms of the stock market losing 800 plus points and 500 plus points. And this has a different situation. Trump right now is alive primarily with many voters on the economy. If the economy changes and there's some sort of trend with the market between now and Election Day in November, that will also take some of the wind out of DJ Trump's sail. And if you have a recession, and depending obviously on the severity of the recession and this whole trade thing, now what you have is, and we'll be talking about this, excuse me, on Numbers Man. That is another program from WBRN Radio and the Boston Red Network. Our macroeconomics program. We'll talk about that and where things are going in terms of a global stratagem. And we have a lot of things going on. The meeting in Bali of the one of the major economic organizations there. And let's see what else we got here real quickly here. State senators, House districts in the Midwest governed by Republicans Party after 2010. They have gotten into those particular situations, and I won't quote him. Some of these we'll go back to this. Ohio in 2012, before 2010, the Republican wave. Democrats control the state house by 53 to 46, and if I can count correctly, what is that? 7 points. Republicans control state houses 66 to 32 with one vacancy. That's from the National Conference of State Legislatures. So you can see what is going on here. And it would go from 2009, Democrats held majority in state legislative seats in Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, 343 to 302, a 23-state advantage. That's not very much. In fact, in 2008, Republicans controlled 415 seats to Democrats' 245, 170-seat advantage, period. So we'll end this, but this economic situation is one that is looking to change some of the topography of these races, how they will turn out. Not necessarily demographic changes, but of how things are going to turn out in the midterm. And how they turn out in 2 years is a little bit different, but Ms. Lake is a little bit ahead of things here. Basically, a lot of volatility in the market here. I'm just looking at Reuters real quickly here, period. The Feds will incidentally raise interest rates another 25 basis points. There's no doubt about that. Asian shares on edge after 9-day rout. A lot of volatility going on in the Asian markets. This will be on Friday. And we'll have more on Friday. Job of the Nikkei fell, 0.6% here. The S&P 500 lost 2.0 percentage points on Friday, following a 3.9 drop on Wednesday. So the market has been dropping, no doubt about it. So we'll have more of this, obviously, on Numbers Man. On to the debate between the two candidates for governor in the state of Minnesota, Johnson and Walz. From Greater Minnesota, this debate came, and it is via WCCO Radio. We're appreciative of that outlet for providing it for us, and also AP and the Star Tribune.
Rio, WCCO, and WCCO HD2, Minneapolis, St. Paul.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to a very important event tonight. My name is Chad Hartman, along with Blois Olson here on WCCO Radio and live here in Wilmer. We are about to have a gubernatorial debate between the two top candidates. Blois Olson will introduce those two gentlemen in a matter of moments. This will be a 90-minute debate. These are two individuals I have interviewed a number of times as a talk show host. The reason why I've been drawn to both these individuals over the years is they give direct, specific answers. There are stark differences between both gentlemen. We want those specific answers tonight. We will be willing to follow up. As Blois told everybody off air, we certainly have spirited supporters of Jeff Johnson and spirited supporters of Tim Walz. We want to be respectful. We want to give both individuals an opportunity to answer as directly as they can, as 1 month from now, we will find out who will be the next governor of the state. Before we start, let's turn it over to Blois Olson. He will lay out the format and formally introduce the two candidates.
Thanks, Chad. We're going to have opening statements from each candidate, and then at the end, we'll have closing statements. We did a coin toss, and Jeff Johnson will go first in the opening and first in the closing, and Tim Walz will go second in the opening and second in the closing. So with that, as Chad said, we want specific answers. We also want to have the candidates will have an opportunity to rebut if they don't like something the opponent said about them. So it says debate up there, and we intend to have this be a debate, not a forum. So I would like to introduce Hennepin County Commissioner, the Republican nominee for governor, Jeff Johnson.
Thank you. Thank you, Chad. Thank you, Blois. Thank you all for being here. I am Jeff Johnson. I was born and raised in Detroit Lakes, Minnesota. My wife is from Crookston, and we went to college in Moorhead. So we are children of northwestern Minnesota, but we have lived in Plymouth now for 20-some years. We have two teenage boys. Thor is in college. Rolf is in high school. I have spent most of my adult life in the private sector. I've actually been self-employed the past 18 or 19 years and also served 6 years in the Minnesota House a while back. Now I'm in my third and final term on the Hennepin County Board. And we have traveled probably over 100,000 miles in this governor's race. I've talked to many tens of thousands of Minnesotans. And I can't tell you how satisfying, how meaningful it is for me to be able to meet so many people and look them in the eye and tell them how we're going to change Minnesota and make their lives better. How we are going to let them keep more of what they earn to spend on their own families or on their own businesses. How we're going to actually start holding government accountable to taxpayers again, and how we're going to change the culture, the attitude in our state government from that of controlling and directing and helping us all make better decisions about our own.
We're good.
You all right?
Yep. There's not a state there. I'm sorry, Jeff.
We just wanted to lighten it up for everybody. I won the coin flip, so I did not have to flip.
You're later on.
Yes.
Right?
Go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah. So as I was saying, how we're able to tell them how we're going to make life better in Minnesota. And the last one I was mentioning was how we're going to change the culture in government, especially some of our state agencies, from that of controlling and directing to actually serving the people who pay their salaries. We've kind of lost that in state government, particularly some of our agencies. And that is such a personal message for people in the state of Minnesota. Whether I'm talking to sportsmen or women about the DNR, or whether I'm talking to child care providers about the Department of Human Services, or farmers about the MPCA or Bowser, It is a very personal message, and people just want their government to serve them again, and it's what I will wake up every single day to do as your governor. So thank you for having us, and I'm looking forward to tonight.
Democratic nominee for governor, Congressman Tim Walz.
Thank you. Well, thank you to Jeff for running a great campaign, and thank you to our hosts tonight for having this. A special thank you to all of you who are here and those listening. Thank you for believing that we can still self-govern together. Thank you for believing that there's things that when we do together and when the state comes together, there is nothing that we can't do. I'm Tim Walz. I'm a public school teacher from Mankato. I'm a football coach. I'm a husband to Gwen, who's a 30-year educator in Mankato, and I'm dad to Hope, who is a senior at Mankato West, and Gus, who's a 6th grader at Dakota Meadows Middle School in Mankato. I wore the uniform of this nation for 24 years, and I've had the privilege for the past 12 years to serve the people of southern Minnesota in the United States Congress. And together we've written, 2.5 farm bills. We'll get this last one done together. We've worked and improved the care of our veterans. We've worked together to improve infrastructure. We've tried to make things where government is more transparent, and we make sure that we're making people see their government as a reflection of themselves. And I've done that together by building coalitions, by bringing people to the table, by making sure that we set our sights high, and we don't talk about what we can't do, we talk about what we can do. When I started this campaign and started traveling just like Jeff across this and meeting people in their homes and in their businesses and on the streets and in armories and VFWs, the one thing that was apparent, the can-do Minnesota spirit is alive and well. We understand what happens when government breaks down. We understand we pit neighbor against neighbor. It holds us back from accomplishing things we need to. So that theme that emerged during this One Minnesota, we're stronger together. That we're not going to divide on economic levels. We're not going to divide racially. We're certainly not going to divide geographically, because when the Twin Cities thrives, Greater Minnesota thrives. And when Greater Minnesota thrives, so does the Twin Cities. That attitude about working together to solve problems is about building better communities. So I thank you all for being here. Look forward to the questions tonight. And again, appreciate your belief that we can do this together. Thank you.
So I will step in and ask the first question. We are in the great city of Wilmer, and we have a lot of people paying attention in Greater Minnesota. We also have a live audience on WCCO radio, so we have a great deal of people listening in the metro area also. So we will have a combination of questions that affects everyone in the state, but also some directly that affect individuals who don't live in the 7-county metro area. And I'll start with that, and I'll start with you, Jeff. I want you to contrast yourself and Tim Walz, and the two of you get along well, and we appreciate that, but we want these differences. Why will you be the better governor if you win this race for Greater Minnesota compared to Congressman Walz?
Well, a couple things. Number one, I think the fact that I spent the first half of my life in Greater Minnesota and essentially the second half of my life in the Twin Cities helps me to bridge a gap that we have in this state right now. There is a great distrust between Greater Minnesota and Metro, and then throw in the urban piece really as a third part, and I've spent every week for the last 10 years in the heart of Minneapolis trying to solve some of those very vexing urban problems as well. And I think in order to bring us together, we need somebody who has the trust of every area of the state, and the fact that I've been in every area of the state makes a big difference. But I think also, if in direct contrast to Tim, you are going to see a different attitude from government than what you've seen for the past 8 years in particular. And I've talked about our state agencies, but I look at the MPCA, I look at the DNR, I look at Bowser. To a lesser extent, but still there, I look at the Department of Agriculture. I look at the Department of Commerce and Human Services, and I talk to farmers and small business owners all over the state, but especially in Greater Minnesota. And they are so tired of this attitude that bureaucrats are going to make decisions for them and then send them down from on high without including anyone in that decision-making, without including the people who are actually being regulated. We are literally driving rural child care providers out of business. We are literally driving farmers out of business because of the attitude in government. I will change that. The bureaucracy is essentially funding Tim's campaign. I don't see him changing that.
Tim?
The question was how do we bring people together in contrast? First of all, I don't travel to Greater Minnesota. I wake up in Greater Minnesota. And this idea that there's a difference there and that we try and wedge that something doesn't understand what's happening. Our values are the same, but our issues that we face may be different. Whether it's housing or childcare, that may manifest itself differently. But I want to give you an example. This is about leadership, and this is about a proven capacity to bring people together. I've done it in classroom, I've done it in uniform, I've done it in Congress. But as a governor, here's what my day looked like today. I woke up in a went to a western suburban VFW and met with veterans out there. Then I went and met with executives from TCF Bank to talk about funding and business growth. And then I went over to St. Paul de Mont Olivet Church, and I met with the Black Ministerial Association talking about what they can do about incarceration rates in their community, about violence in their community, about what they can do to make sure their children close the achievement gap. And then I went over into central Minneapolis and met with some of the biggest Fortune 500 companies executives at the Business Partnership, talking about ways on those same issues, what they can do to help us close those gaps, because that workforce they're going to need is going to come from that community. And strong communities can't pit one against another. And having done it in Congress to bridge a gap, to improve GI bills, to write farm bills across difficult times, and to be consistently shown as one of the most bipartisan members of Congress, with bipartisanship comes effectiveness. Minnesotans are hungry to quit the divide. They're hungry to find effective and efficient ways that we can deliver services, and they are hungry to make this state work even better. I can do that as your governor.
Let me just follow up real quick with the commissioner on this, because I've heard the congressman say that often. And it appears to me it's an inference towards you that he believes he can unite the state better than you. How do you handle that when you hear that? Because that clearly is a part of what the congressman believes he has done as a congressman and believes that he will do more effectively than you if he wins.
I think you just have to look at records, and I think you have to look at personalities. And, Tim, I think our personalities are actually pretty similar. Your voting record is quite liberal. I mean, you were with Nancy Pelosi and Keith Ellison over 90% of the time. I think it's 94%. So this suggestion that you're one of the most bipartisan people there, the bar is pretty low, unfortunately, in Congress right now. I think if you look at our records, if you look at what we have done, or look at what I have done at least in the legislature in my 6 years there, carrying bipartisan legislation successfully, which became law, which essentially rewrote property rights in the state of Minnesota, which essentially ended meth labs in the state of Minnesota, the biggest reform of lawsuit abuse that we've ever seen, or at least in the last several decades in the state of Minnesota, each time with a DFLer as a chief author in the Senate, because the Senate was controlled by the DFL. When I was in the House, you will see that I don't just talk about bipartisanship, we've actually carried bills. And then take a look at the Hennepin County Board. I'm in a minority of one on the Hennepin County Board. I am the frequently very lonely conservative in the heart of Minneapolis. But I think you will also see, even though my worldview is quite different from my colleagues, that we are able to work together on certain things, like measuring programs to make sure they actually work, like working on public safety issues such as body cameras, and working through some really difficult issues to make that actually happen in Minneapolis and Hennepin County, and several other issues. So I think that the proof is in the pudding, and you have to look at not just how people talk, but what the actual record is.
Congressman, I'll give you a chance to follow up, too, and specific to what the commissioner had to say, because we've seen a lot of races at the governor's race, Senate races, and also congressional races where numbers are cited about who people vote with. Jeff Johnson just said that you vote with Nancy Pelosi and Keith Ellison well over 90%, trying to defy that you do work across party lines. Is that a fair criticism?
Well, no, it's what if those are post office namings at time, I would ask Jeff, would you have voted with Nancy Pelosi to improve veteran suicide care? Would you have voted with Nancy Pelosi to improve the GI Bill with me? Would you have voted on many of those things that all of you would agree with? This is what's wrong with our system about finding a voting record in Congress. Here's what I would say is, you know who knows best about this? The citizens of southern Minnesota that voted 15 percentage points for Donald Trump and still voted for me. They sent me back 6 times knowing who I am. So to tell those voters they don't know who they get, or to pull out a statistic that is meant to try and do that, that gets more of the division. I'm interested in finding the solutions. I'm interested in finding those people who vote the other way and bringing them in. I'm interested in building counterintuitive coalitions to tackle these toughest problems. So when it comes time to try and deal with, say, for example, in the VA, we know a lot of veterans were trying to find out if they could use medicinal marijuana to make this happen. No one in the history of this country ever moved a bill on the federal level, but I was able to move one because I didn't chase the folks, just the physicians or those who wanted to decriminalize marijuana. I went out and brought the American Legion into that fight. And now we have it, because those are finding real solutions that people want. So, no, I think it's about results and it's about effectiveness.
All right, last follow-up from Jeff, and then we'll turn it over to Blois.
Sure. So, Tim, you talk about your record in southern Minnesota in Congress, but it has changed rather dramatically over the last year and a half during this primary. You've taken, I think, some pretty new and pretty extreme far-left positions. So I think that, and that's part of what this election and this campaign is about, to make sure people know where we stand on things like immigration, on things like health care, on things like taxes, on things like guns. Your positions have changed dramatically in order to win a primary, and I think sometimes the question is, which positions are you going to take as governor? And I'm not sure the answer to that question.
Well, that's unfair. That's an attack. If you disagree with the positions I'm standing at, that's a position of your values and your core values. I think you want a leader who is able to adapt to changing situations. I've certainly been clear to people, whether it's on the issues of Second Amendment rights. I served 24 years in the military to protect that right. I own guns myself. I believe that you should have those rights, but I also believe a responsibility to make sure we're doing smart things, which we've always done, to protect children and make a difference. Those are evolutionary changes as our society changes, and those votes are going back several years. But it's this piece of this, of trying to pull this out, saying that's there. We're never going to find solutions if we can't bring people over to see things from a different way. We're never going to find solutions. Again, you'll never change the system if you yourself can't change to bring people in. So I simply believe that the effectiveness I've seen, the ability to lead in different situations, that's what Minnesota's looking for.
All right, moving on to an issue that impacts all of Minnesota with very different views in greater Minnesota and the metro area. We'll start with Congressman Walz. Congressman, you've said you support an increase in the gas tax. How do you make sure that any new revenue is balanced between the needs for roads and bridges and transportation in greater Minnesota and transit projects in the metro area?
Yeah, first of all, I don't know if many of you probably saw this today. The engineering scorecard for Minnesota's infrastructure came out. It was a C or C minus, I believe. On roads, it was a D minus. I'm not telling you anything. You drive on them. You understand this. That the ability to have a world-class transportation system is absolutely critical for safety of our families. It's absolutely critical for growth of our economy. It's one of the things that separated Minnesota from other states. We also know that it's multimodal. And meaning that we're going to have transit where transit makes sense. We're going to have highways where highways make sense. We have a differentiation between township bridges. And we also have to think about the locks and dams on the Mississippi River, certainly a federal government responsibility, but one that really matters to us. So what I have said is this backlog is continuing to grow. And I said, I think you have to have an honest conversation with the citizens of Minnesota who will pay for things that they know improve this country, in this state. They will pay for things that they know make a difference for future generations in this country and in this state. And so when asked about this directly, I said, I think you have to take a look at this. Minnesota has 28.5 cents on the gas tax. The median average in the country is about 31. I understand that. Gas has gone up in the last 2 years 92 cents. So I know the burden that goes on families, but I also know the job creation, and I know we spend an awful lot of money, to the tune in this country, hundreds of millions of dollars on idling tax, repairs to our automobiles, because we're not improving that. So going to the question of how do you balance this, this is how we make sure that we are one Minnesota. That transit program that's moving people into the Twin Cities is critically important for them. We have rural transit, but we also have a need that is very high. In Jackson County, we built a $3 million plus bridge that predominantly served 15 families. And I heard someone criticizing that, and I said, oh, the addendum to that is those 15 families feed about 40,000 people. So we're stronger together. We're stronger when we use the state's ability. Those 15 families couldn't have paid for that bridge, but we're going to benefit from that. And the Twin Cities, making the investments themselves into transit makes sense. So we work together. We see this as the whole picture. That's the role of government, to build and to see once that happens, the private sector will thrive when our infrastructure matches the needs. So that's how I think you balance it. I think you work with legislators. You make the case that we're not going to do this ridiculous thing of pitting greater Minnesota against the Twin Cities on transit. We make sure that there's a balanced approach that serves all of us.
Commissioner Johnson,
So, Tim, you haven't said that you are open to a gas tax increase. You said you will raise the gas tax at least 30%.
The governor does not raise the gas tax. The legislator does. The governor sets a vision and said that we need to talk about revenues.
Yeah, Tim, you said right on your website, we will raise the gas tax. So you got to decide what your position is on that. But I don't think we need an increase in the gas tax. We are one of the highest tax states in America. We've seen a 53% increase in spending in 8 years in Minnesota, and then we claim that we can't do the basic things of government. And it's because we don't focus. I mentioned I have 2 teenage boys, and I can tell you starting at about age 10 or 11, they'd come home from school every day, and if I was home, the job was get them to do their homework. And they'd say, well, can I do it while the TV's on? And I'd say, no, you need to focus. Well, can I have my earphones in? It's, no, you got to focus. Well, how about if I eat while I'm doing it? No, focus. Government can't do that. It's too easy to spend other people's money, and we don't force ourselves to focus. And with respect to transportation, it's about focusing on what people rely upon. And so for me, that means roads and bridges and a world-class bus system. I believe in a multimodal system, too. I've lived in Washington, D.C., and Chicago, and Minneapolis, as well as the suburbs. And I've used buses, and I've used trains, at least when I lived in Chicago, because they made some sense there. But right now in Minnesota, we can have a world-class bus system at a tiny fraction of the ongoing cost of a light rail train or trolley cars, which is what we now apparently want to spend hundreds of millions of dollars on. Bringing back the trolley system that was ripped up about 100 years ago because it was outdated. Let's focus on those things that allow people and goods to get where they need to go, rather than just having this philosophy of throwing money everywhere and then saying we don't have enough to do the basics. It's about focus.
Well, first of all, no one's saying throw money anywhere. I'm a middle-class public school teacher who understands those investments, and you get what you pay for. But I want you to make a connection here to this. Jeff's time in the legislature was when things changed dramatically for greater Minnesota. That's when we decided to pull back local government aid, LGA. And that was the assistance that we looked at One Minnesota, where we invested the same way we did with our schools, understanding that smaller school districts with lower property tax bases, it was going to be more expensive and more difficult to give the same education. So we equalized across there. So this cut on LGA, to be very clear with this, I see the signs all over Wilmer. You're going to vote to raise your local sales tax to do the things that we have a proposal that is being signed up by city councils from Fergus Falls to Austin, a community prosperity grant. By restoring local government aid, what it ends up happening is that helps equalize for those projects. You're looking at water projects, you're looking at, it may be something as far as daycare or helping with affordable housing. But when you talk about this, the highest tax state, doesn't take into the whole picture on this. We're 48th in the return on federal dollars. We're subsidizing a whole lot of states that aren't doing what they need to do, and they count on the federal government to buy those social services underneath because it's not happening. So we always should watch every taxpayer dollar. Let's be very clear. You get what you pay for. We need this apparently out here. There's going to be a debate, and you're going to vote on it, that you need this critical infrastructure. I would argue it weakens us because as Wilmer does well, so does Mankato, and so does Minnetonka, and so does International Falls. When we see ourselves collectively to make those decisions smartly together, using local leadership input. Jeff is saying he knows better than the leaders in our metropolitan area to make some of those decisions. As governor, my job is to build the coalition and to talk about those things. So be very clear about this. The property tax shift that happened because of local government aid still falls upon you. The question is, what happens to communities that don't have the capacity to do what you're attempting to do here? You go without it, and the quality of life decreases.
So I still want to focus on transportation. And
I want to talk about LGA now.
Commissioner Johnson, it's overwhelming opinions of Minnesotans that we do need more money spent on roads, bridges.
And I agree with that.
So if there's no new revenue, how do you pay for it?
Well, once again, I will go back to, as a starting point, let's focus on what's important in society. And I believe transportation, at least the forms of transportation that people rely on, is very important. I don't believe we need new taxes. I do believe, however, that if we spent a little bit of money from the general fund for transportation, for roads and bridges, maybe even a bus system, that wouldn't be a bad thing. It's almost entirely funded by user fees. Roads and bridges are right now in the state of Minnesota, if you're talking about state funding. I'm also open to using more of a bonding bill for that, because these are long-term projects that often have either statewide or more likely regional significance. So there are other sources of revenue, but we actually have to have the backbone to say, let's prioritize those things that are most important, rather than saying, well, we've decided to spend on everything under the sun after a 53% increase in spending, and now we just don't have enough money to fill the potholes. That's not responsible government at all.
If I could just say, I agree with Jeff on the bonding piece of this, but I'd also like to say, if it comes from the general fund, get ready to do your school levy referendum then too. We haven't indexed that to inflation, and Jeff can talk about the cost has gone up. Price of everything goes up every year. By not indexing school and levy funding and in the formula, school districts have lost $618 per pupil just as things went up. The cost of pencils went up. The cost of paper went up. All of those things went up. So you can go ahead and take it from the general fund, but it's coming back to you. And this thing of the LGA and the shift back to the general fund has a bigger impact on greater Minnesota because if the smaller property tax base was there and drives up property taxes, it drives up local sales taxes like you're doing, and now you're talking again of taking more from that. So we have to have this discussion, but this straw man argument that we're just throwing money or whatever, I am not interested in us looking like a mediocre state. I'm interested in guarding every dollar that you have, but making sure that we have a world-class education system. Our people provided health care because it's morally the right thing to do, but it provides a better workforce, and making sure our infrastructure is world-class. Those who came before us invested, and now we want to give tax cuts and underinvest so that we can pass that on to our children. That's not what Minnesotans do. We build for the future.
But, Tim, you can't say you want to be careful with people's money, because we've been watching throughout this race, and you have promised spending increases to absolutely every single solitary group that has asked for them.
That is false.
Well, maybe you said no to somebody once, but if you look at the questionnaires, I mean, we've got the list. Just Education Minnesota alone had, I think, 82 questions. And you answered every one of them, quote unquote, correctly, and almost all of them were just one new funding stream after another. There was no reform in there. There was no accountability in there. There was no innovation in there. It's always about just more money, more money, more money. And our calculation is that you're at about $18.5 billion per year of new spending with a $24 billion annual budget. We can't promise the world to everyone and then claim that we're going to be careful with their money. It's just, and maybe it's a case where once you get elected, you're going to sort through it and decide which promises to keep and which not to keep. That's what I hope it is. Otherwise, no one's going to be able to afford to live here anymore. We have to be more careful with other people's money.
We're going to talk about education and some other issues in a little bit. But now I'm going to hand it over to Don Wick from the Red River Farm Network. And Don's going to ask some questions about agriculture in greater Minnesota.
First of all, thanks for being here and this opportunity. Buffers certainly have been a topic that we've had in agriculture in recent years. I'm curious your position on a tax credit for buffers and really your position on the buffer issue itself.
Who starts?
Sure.
First of all, this issue and the false choices we make, again, I represent the 9th largest agricultural district in the country and have written farm bills with many of you and working with our commodity groups, working with our multi-commodity groups. The first thing I can be very, very clear and certain to all of you is that our producers, first of all, are feeding, clothing, powering, and now innovating in so many ways the world. This is an incredible engine. It's the backbone of this. It's time to have a governor who has extensive agricultural experience. I also know that our producers are deeply concerned about sustainability of their land. Their topsoil is their heritage, their future, their children's future. So this false choice of trying to set this up in a way that, again, it's not about trying to clean the water. With the buffers, it was about how it was implemented, how it was rolled out, and the lack of what I think I do best, collaboration and working together to find those solutions. So in Minnesota, none of you are asking, and it Jeff said we just roll it all back, get rid of it all. Well, 85 to 90%. We're already doing it voluntarily because it's the right thing to do. But we need to be incredibly careful, especially with productive lands. The answer is yes. You cannot take productive lands out of production without all of us who are benefiting from that decision be made, pitching in and making sure we pay for that. So yes, I agree that you do a tax credit for those lands, you make it work, and we reset this relationship because all of us are striving for the same goals here. Economic activity with sustainability and smart policies that work together. We did it in the last Farm Bill where we did conservation compliance. We didn't have to have the stick. We didn't even have to have the carrot. We worked with people to get to that and said, once you meet these requirements, then we will have the federal programs that help you, whether it's crop insurance, EQIP, or others. We got 98% compliance the first year. This does not need to divide the state. We don't need to deny that we need to make sure all of us are responsible for the heritage of our water, but we can't take away the production that is at the heart of much of our economic growth, which is agriculture. So that solution's out there. This is the win-win. That's a one Minnesota solution, and I know it's out there. We've done it in farm bills.
So the answer is yes. I would certainly support a tax credit. I actually believe this is an unconstitutional taking of property without compensation. It's in our Minnesota and our federal Constitution. But there's a bigger picture here, because I think this is one of the poster children when I talk about the arrogance of our state agencies and our state government. This was a solution to a problem, the problem of keeping water clean, that didn't include the people who were being regulated. And I have yet to talk to a farmer who doesn't care about the quality of the water. They rely on that. They live there. It's their community. And I've talked to farmers who said, this isn't working for me. But here's some other ideas of things that would, but no one ever asked us. We were just told. It came down from on high. And that is the attitude, and it's not just in one or two agencies. We've got it spread around in state government right now. I actually believe that we should have a requirement in Minnesota that says regulators in our state agencies, or at least certain regulators in our state agencies, should have to spend, I don't know, maybe a week every year working for the people they regulate so they can get a feeling for what their regulations actually do. So whether it's a farmer, whether it's a child care provider, whether it's a group home regulator, and you know what? I'd say the same thing for the governor and legislators, too, because I think many times we're detached and we get into this mindset that we have all the answers because we've got a great research staff around us. But no, we need to include the people who are being regulated, and this is one of the best examples out there of the arrogance of our state agencies.
I kind of like this idea of having to do things on that. And I think if you're going to be governor, you should teach some school then before you criticize school. Amen. And tell me that all I was doing was running things up. I also think you saw something very interesting in style on this was. When this answer was first questioned, Jeff, and I know all of you feel very strongly about this, and I think it's a fair question to ask. Jeff asked about the constitutionality of this. I would rather us fix this together than go to court for 10 years. I would rather us find solutions that go to that. Not being an attorney, I don't default to the sue position. I default to how do we find compromise here and how do we mediate to the point of getting there. So again, this false narrative, I don't want to waste one penny, but I understand that if we work together, and it's a term that I've used since I've been in Congress, and I used it in the Farm Bill hearing years ago on this idea of regulatory humility. We should have regulatory humility, meaning we're working with you, but those agencies are in place. It is the governor's role. And I am not Governor Dayton, and I'm a different style. And that has been brought to it, and many of you see the difference in that. So to try and make a straw man argument about that is wrong. But this is not that intractable. But if you take it to that place where it becomes us versus them, or they don't care, or we can't bring folks from greater Minnesota to the Twin Cities to agree upon this, we should be finding solutions that don't involve going to court, dividing our neighbors, or not focusing on what really matters. This is a win-win. We can produce food and clean our water. I've seen it.
Let me add something to that. Tim, I don't default to the sue position, but I do default to the giving people rights over government position, especially their constitutional rights. And if you were listening closely, I did not criticize teachers. I never criticize teachers. I did criticize the union. I think there's a difference between the two.
Don?
That teachers union member is my son's sixth grade teacher. Just keep that in mind. Looking to improve that school classroom. So,
Don,
if I can,
no boogeyman.
One more question. Switch gears here. Minnesota is the first state to have a B20, 20% mandate on biodiesel. We're the first state with a 10% ethanol requirement. What's your position on ways to further grow the renewable fuel industry here in Minnesota?
Yeah, you know, I actually have been supportive of renewables. I'm an all-of-the-above sort of guy, and I have seen that industries have been created, especially in greater Minnesota, based upon what government has done. Now, I'm not a mandate guy. I don't generally like government putting its thumb on the scale. However, with respect to what we've seen with biofuels and with ethanol, Government enticed the private sector to create an industry that has been wildly successful. And now it's completely wrong for government to say, now we're going to pull the rug out from under that. So I will continue to support that and do whatever I can to promote it, because that industry is there, and it's been a huge boon to greater Minnesota.
Well, you don't need to guess on this. I've been Congress's biggest supporter of our biofuels. Our biofuel industry is exactly the thing I'm talking about, the can-do Minnesota spirit. That was created with the know-how. It created markets that were close to home. It created innovation. It allowed a graduate of Preston High School to go to Winona State University and get a chemistry degree and come back and get a job that pays $80,000 being a chemist producing biofuels right here at home. It makes no sense to me why we would spend $1 billion for fuel from countries that hate us. They'll hate us for free. We can do jobs here at home. And the industry... The industry here needs to have the same support. So to try and pretend that the market on this is, I can tell you one thing I have never seen around our biodiesel plants is a carrier battle group patrolling, like we have to do with shipping lanes around the world to bring oil and other things in. This makes sense. It addresses what you all saw if you saw the front page of the Star Tribune today, this issue of climate change and addressing it in a smart Minnesota manner. We can not only address that, we can not only get sustainability, we can create an economy that is incredibly strong. So you can be sure as governor, I will be the biggest champion of this. Ways that we can do this is we can make sure the mandate's in place. We can making sure that we're continuing research at the University of Minnesota to improve the efficiencies. We can make sure that we're doing and partnering with the infrastructure to make sure that every station has the capacity to pump. We can make sure as that research moves forward, we can maybe move from B5 in the winter to B10, extend that season, make sure we expand out to other markets. This is smart Minnesota ingenuity. It makes sense all the way around, and this is an example of a win-win-win. But to try and pretend that it's not going to take some incentivizing or some leadership from government is simply false. That industry worked hand in hand. That's why we grew.
I'm going to remind the radio audience that you're listening to a gubernatorial debate between Tim Walz and Jeff Johnson. We're in the great city here of Wilmer. Chad Hartman along with Blois Olson. I'm going to ask a health care question to Congressman Walz, and then Blois will have a question for Commissioner Johnson. Congressman, for a long time you were a big believer in the Affordable Care Act. You defended that. You still defend it.
Yes.
But you have stated that you believe single payer is the way to go, that we can evolve into that eventually. Is that a fair assessment?
My answer was that I said I think it's probably inevitable because in every other industrialized nation, that's what we've worked on. So,
but
yes. But I'm open to what that looks like.
Okay, but do you want that to happen?
Can I answer the question?
Yeah.
Is that the question?
Well, what I want to say is you can answer it this two ways. There are a lot of people who look at the size of government already, whether it's the growth that took place under President Obama, the growth that's taken place under President Trump. They look at the growth that took place under Governor Dayton, that they see the growth of government, they see health care, and they worry about turning too much of that over to the government. That, yes, they want health care to be better, but they worry about turning over too much of the government. Can it be effective, and can the economy handle, at the state level and at the federal level, government getting significantly bigger?
Yeah, well, multi-pronged questions here. First of all, this nation spends twice as much on health care as any other nation, and we rank about 37th in results from that. I simply believe we're better than that. I believe we can achieve outcomes better than anyone else. And there are ways and there's science behind how we do that. But going back to the Affordable Care Act, the ability to make sure that we had people mandated, the idea of an individual mandate, to spread a risk pool across, to bring down costs that were skyrocketing. Don't pretend that prior to 2009, that rates were fantastic or they were going down. They were going skyrocketing, and we all knew it. So trying to make some containments and trying to work together. We didn't get much help on that, obviously, and we knew that healthcare is a journey, not a destination. We're going to continue to have to improve on that. But here's an example. From 2009 to 2016, in Candiota County, we reduced those that were insured by 50%. And here's what that means. We are never, ever going to... What people want out of healthcare is you don't want to have to use it. That's the thing that you want. If you do, you want it to be accessible, quality, and affordable. And there are things that in healthcare, if we agree on the premise that healthcare is a basic human need or right, we have to be smart about how we're making sure we're incentivizing providers, because the three prongs of healthcare are the person receiving the healthcare, the person delivering the healthcare, and the payer. And so this issue of on this, however this looks, the bulk of our money is being spent here. and we're not getting the results. So if we are ever going to get a handle on this, we are going to have to make sure that people are covered early so they can prevent things that cost a lot of money on the end. And we are going to have to make the case where we are well positioned right here in what we can call Medical Alley, that we're going to have to figure out that the only way to bring down these costs in the long run is to understand what's driving up the costs in the first place. And I challenge all of you to go tell me what it costs to fix a broken arm is. There's no market. There's no price transparency. Once those things happen, we can start to focus on the cost drivers that are driving up healthcare in the first place. We can focus on about 4 or 5 diseases that account for 85% of our spending. And if we do this, we achieve several things. We achieve the moral responsibility to allow people to live a healthy, as happy as life as they can. We keep people working and contributing to our society, and we keep this idea of growth going forward. So the boogeyman of it's government takeover or whatever, how many are Medicare in here? How many use the VA? Yeah. How many expect to be in long-term care? Because in the 1st District of Minnesota, those that are in long-term care, 74.5% of them are on Medicaid. That's the only way to pay for it. So we're missing the argument that we are shuffling around the circle wrapped around the axle on insurance reform alone, instead of focusing on the things that Minnesota is well positioned with. We have more people covered by insurance, and we are healthier than other states. That gives us a really incredible leap. So to go to this point is, I don't care necessarily what that payer looks like. As long as we're getting value for our dollars, we are improving that care receiver's health, and we are adequately compensating the care providers. That's what we need to figure out together.
So, can I?
Go ahead, Jeff.
Yes. I didn't hear the answer to the question whether you still want Minnesota to be a single-payer state, because
I'll say it again. I don't necessarily care what this looks like, but the payer piece of this is going to impact the results for the individuals getting the care and making sure we're compensating that. There are many different models that have been tried. Most of the other industrialized nations who get better outcomes with cheaper price have ended up cutting the payer out of that. I don't know if Minnesota can be better, but I just talked to folks at Blue Cross Blue Shield today, and they said they need to move out of being a claims-paying organization and being a wellness organization that prevents the illness in the first place. That's the model that Minnesota can go to. So that's what I'm talking about.
You still didn't answer the question, but I'll just rely upon what you've said in the past, which is that you do want to become single payer. And we have to understand what single payer means, because it sounds great. But single payer means there isn't private insurance anymore. We all lose our insurance, and we're all forced onto one government plan. I think we need to move in exactly the opposite direction, because one of the reasons we're in such a terrible spot right now is because government took over a lot of what we were doing really well in Minnesota. Minnesota had the best healthcare system in America. You could ask people in almost any state in this country 10, 15 years ago, we did it better than anyone. We were far from perfect. Nobody claims that we were perfect. Nobody claims we couldn't have been much better. But we did it really, really well. And then Obamacare came along, and MNsure came along, and we kind of got sucked down to the same level as everybody else, and now we don't do it better than everyone else anymore. So for me, we need to do two things. And it's not give total control over to the government that can't figure out how to issue car tabs right now. It is... It is two things. Number one, let's make sure we're taking care of people who need help in this state. And that includes people with pre-existing conditions. And I know you've all seen the $2.5 million worth of commercials that an outside liberal group is putting on that says, I will eliminate that. It's based on nothing I've ever said, but it goes to that political philosophy that if you repeat a lie enough times, some people will believe it. We have a value in this state, and we've had it for over 30 years, that we will guarantee affordable coverage for people with pre-existing conditions, and that will continue if I'm governor. But then, let's look at the vast majority of people who don't have pre-existing conditions and are paying for either all or part of their insurance because they have been clobbered the past decade or so. Yes, premiums were rising before Obamacare. It got worse in Minnesota, and we could go through those numbers, but it definitely got worse. And if you're in the individual market, if you're a farmer or a small business owner, you went bankrupt the last few years until the legislature spent $500 million to kind of prop up the system. And that is not sustainable. So we have to actually give individuals more control over their own health care and more options in their health insurance rather than taking away every single option they have. And there's a lot of ways we can do that. We can change the law to encourage employers to self-insure, which creates direct competition with the insurers. We can allow groups to pool together, small farmers, groups of farmers or groups of small churches to pool together and create competition. We can do more to allow individuals to buy flexible benefit plans rather than government saying this is what your policy has to look like. I believe in giving more control to people while continuing to take care of those who need it, because that's what we've always done in Minnesota.
I would ask all of you, go shop for it. This is simply a fundamental misunderstanding how healthcare works. I have been at this and represent the Mayo Clinic to try and say Minnesota is going to operate in a vacuum. The entire system is underpinned by Medicare, Medicaid, and the VA system. What the ACA did was extend the life of Medicare and Medicaid, which was able to stabilize the system. But what Jeff is, the failure to understand this issue, and first of all, I'd like to make a note of the pre-existing condition thing. The very station that we're on right now did the fact check, and it's absolutely true. And everyone sees this, that where you're moving on and saying this pre-existing condition issue, you are going to be kicked off if you have a pre-existing condition. And Jeff's position that we're going to have a la carte things. Okay, here's the thing. I get it. It's very appealing. If I'm 25, or let's say I'm 28, so now I can't stay on. All of you who have children who are up to the 26 who benefited from the ACA know what the difference that made. So let's say you get to 28, you decide, I'm healthy and I'm fine, and you don't buy into the system. The pool shrinks, the pool shrinks, the pool shrinks. Rates go up. The idea is here's how insurance works. The same way with your car insurance. Everyone gets insurance and was required to have insurance. And then what it does is lower the rates for everyone. Certainly we're going to have people who are going to need more care, and those are the elderly. And it's why we went to a system that no one is asking us to get rid of, the Medicare system, that makes everyone have coverage and everyone have the capacity. So this idea that you're going to give you more choices and free choice or whatever, if it were a perfect world and if there were a true market in healthcare, but there is not. So if I ask you this, how many of you just want to be given a check and you can go shop and we'll get rid of Medicare and good luck? Because here's what I would say. I asked this question and I will bring them to you. I asked that very question when I had a Blue Cross Blue Shield person standing beside you, and he said, you can't afford it. And this person goes, you don't know how much money I have. He said, I'm telling you, you can't afford it. Because that issue of how it subsidizes through. So we're looking for the solution. But the boogeyman, that it's single payer, whatever it is, let's get to the heart of this. Costs are rampant. People can't afford it. It's not government takeover. I don't care who is able to deliver that the best. But we need to understand that if you don't cover everyone, we're paying for it anyway. If we don't have everybody focusing on the front end of prevention, it costs more in the long run. And we as Minnesota can capitalize on this, not just with a healthier population, but we have the infrastructure with the University of Minnesota, the Mayo Clinic, Medtronic, Boston Scientific, all of these companies that can lead us down that road. But this boogeyman of, the ACA is taking this away or whatever, that is so far past that we need to move beyond real solutions, and that's what we're offering.
So, Commissioner Johnson.
Wait. Jim, I still don't have a clue what your position is on single payer. And it's the most important issue in this election. And let me just add this about single payer. When we talk about, well, maybe it's reasonable, maybe we should do it because other countries do it. We'd be the only state in America with a single payer plan. And I can tell you that Vermont and California were moving along that path 2 and 3 years ago. And last year, or it might have been 2 years ago, they both abandoned it because they said it would require such a humongous tax increase that they couldn't afford it. California and Vermont. Just think about that for a minute. It's not good for Minnesota. We need people to have control, not government.
You have no solution.
I just told you my solution.
You have nothing.
It's about giving people control.
All right,
there is
gentlemen,
there's nothing in the data that shows that does anything about it.
We're about to get to that part.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's jump in and let Blois ask this question.
Commissioner Johnson, you held a news conference today on criticizing Congressman Walz's plan, just like you did up here. But one of the challenges, especially in greater Minnesota, is provider and plan choice, both insurance plan choice and then recruiting physicians and having clinics and access.
Yep.
Previously, one of the challenges was that when people couldn't afford or didn't have insurance, that the bill would be left with those local and rural providers. If you go back to more choices, how do you ensure that rural hospitals are financially stable?
Well, the first thing we have to do is address the reimbursement issue, because that is what is killing a lot of rural hospitals and clinics right now. And if you want to go to single payer or Minnesota Care buy-in, the Hospital Association itself has said this is going to drive hospitals out of business.
That's false.
Oh, no, it's true.
Jeff, there's no public statement from the Hospital Association on that.
They do not support this because
Is
they
there
know.
a public statement from the Hospital Association
Absolutely.
not supporting that?
There
Okay,
is.
we'll verify.
Yes, there is. In fact, I cited it today. And they also stated that 39% of the hospitals in Minnesota are operating at a loss, and the majority of the rest of them are operating on this tiny margin. And so now we're going to move more people onto a government plan that has cut rate reimbursement rates. It is going to literally drive hospitals out of business in greater Minnesota. So that's the piece that we have to look at. Let's try to move as many people into private insurance as we can, knowing that we're going to have to subsidize people in order to allow them to keep their insurance. Right now we have Minnesota Care, which is funded 97% by the federal government. And then we've got our Health Care Access Fund, which we have been using to fund most of MA, most of medical assistance in Minnesota. The money is there, but if we don't solve this reimbursement issue, and by the way, the two plans that Tim's been talking about makes that reimbursement issue much worse, rural hospitals aren't going to survive, period.
So one follow-up on that with the Healthcare Access Fund. Do you support keeping the provider tax in place to continue to fund it?
No, I do not, because that provider tax was created 20 or 30 years ago when Minnesota Care was first implemented. And for many years after that, it became a bipartisan effort. When I was in the House, it was a bipartisan effort to say, we don't like the sick tax. It's essentially a tax on me bringing my kid to the doctor or to the dentist. And we complain about the cost of health care, but then we tax every trip you make, and we know that they just pass that on to the consumer. That's the way this works. So it actually increased the cost. So I have never supported the provider tax or the sick tax. It is scheduled to go away. The governor signed that bill saying that it should go away, and now there's a big push to revive it. But as I mentioned, right now, Minnesota Care is funded 97% by the federal government. If that changes, could down the road, then we're going to have to look at where that funding source comes from.
I'm going to respond to this question because Jeff did hold a press conference. And this is the difference in style, and this is the difference between one Minnesota and a divided Minnesota. Jeff held a press conference to criticize programs that I put out in conjunction with numerous groups that we can provide you to, healthcare groups and folks that we've worked with over the years on providing this. And in a 15-minute question and answer, when he was asked about, what about this, what about this, what about this, he answered, I don't know, 12 times in a row, I don't know. And at one point he said, I don't trust my judgment on this, when asked specifically about what it was. But it's deeper than that, because there are two ads running now in healthcare. Jeff's running a cute ad with people trying to pull on two biggest shirts and two smallest shirts and saying Tim Walz has a one plan, size fits all, and we don't need this, with no offering of what's going to be different. My ad is me talking about losing my father at 19 years old, them not paying for chemotherapy, my mother having to go back to work for 10 years when she was in her 50s to try and pay a bill for that. And it shows people that are on there with a real doctor who are trying to figure out this is about people. This is not about cute statements, single payer, whatever. It's about people's lives. And the fact of the matter is, many of you sitting right in here right now, if you have a pre-existing condition or you don't have health care, this is catastrophic for your life. This may be a fundamental difference between us in that I simply refuse to believe that in this state and in this nation that we cannot provide basic health care to all of our citizens. And that's the plans that I'm trying to offer. So a press conference to critique a plan that's trying to get there versus one that's trying to say, I want to work with you to find that, and these groups are out there. That's a big difference, and that's what that press conference is about. If I hold a press conference, it will not be critiquing Jeff Johnson. It'll be about telling you what I will do to bring the state together to solve this problem.
Yeah, Tim. And Tim, if you had listened to the press conference, you will know that I spent about half the time talking about what I would do and about half the time talking about what you would do, because you don't often talk about what you'll do. I've never seen a plan. If I go on your website, there is no health care plan. There's a couple of 3 sentences that make me feel real warm, but they're not based on anything. We actually go on our website. There's a 10 or 12 point with great details about how we'll do this, how we will take care of people who need help in this state, as we always have, and then how we're going to help bring down the costs of premiums, which nobody has seemed to care about under Obamacare because it made it worse. How we're going to do that by giving people more options and more choices and forcing more competition into the system. That plan is actually there. And I don't know if I said I don't know 12 times, but there was a reporter who asked me the same question 10 or 12 times, so I probably answered it the same way. But one of my comments was, you're going to ask me about minute details. I'm not going to give you an answer based on what I think. As we look at these bigger issues, I'm going to bring people who actually understand health care on the ground. Not just the chair of the committee, not just somebody who is a lobbyist for the hospitals, but doctors and patient advocates and people who are on the ground to help us make decisions about how to implement these changes and how to create more competition.
All right, we're going to move on.
Can I give my pro tip of the day? Bring them to a press conference then when you're going to do that. That's a helpful way for people to get that information. That's what I do. I bring the providers. I bring people. We did this week. Kelly from Pine Island had a brain tumor at 20. And then we brought the president of the Minnesota Medical Association to try and figure out how we're going to do that. That's real problem solving. The otherwise it's just political grandstanding. That's a big difference.
Okay. We're going to move on. We're in Wilmer, Minnesota. This community has adapted and dealt with immigration quite a bit over the last few years. Commissioner Johnson, you've criticized certain communities and suggested that we stop funding non-citizen immigrant programs in the state.
Refugee resettlement.
Refugee resettlement.
Very different.
Okay.
Yes.
This is a community that has had refugees settle here and find jobs. Getting people to work in greater Minnesota to fill unmet jobs is a big challenge. How do you do it as governor in a different way if there's not refugee resettlement?
Sure. So, and I think that's an important distinction, because I hear all the time people who mix up immigration with refugee resettlement, with illegal immigration. Those are 3 very different things. And I have some feelings on legal immigration. That's largely a federal issue, but I do believe that we should move more towards a merit system rather than chain migration. But that's going to be largely up to federal officials. I'll give them my opinion and hope they listen to it. But with respect to refugee resettlement, we actually have a really proud history in this state. I remember growing up in Detroit Lakes as a kid, and we had a few refugee families who came over during my childhood, and we had lots of community involvement, including with my family, to help them succeed and achieve the American dream. There was church involvement, there was a lot of family involvement, and the success stories we have to tell from the past with our refugee resettlement program is actually very moving to me. Minnesota has been more generous with this program than any state in the country by a lot. It's not even marginally close. I think we have 13% of the refugees and 2% of the population. So Minnesota has done a lot. But the last few years, there are some communities that are voicing very real, significant concerns about the cost of the program and whether it is working for their community. St. Cloud is the one that stands out, but there are others. There are several others where I've heard from people, and they say, we don't know how many refugees we have here, and we don't know what the cost is, whether it's the cost to our school system, whether it's the cost to our county, whether it's the cost to our city. We know that the state cost is tremendous, hundreds of millions of dollars a year, according to this administration itself. And when, in St. Cloud at least, some citizens said, hey, can we have a pause on this until we can figure out what the costs are? The answer was, you're racist. You're white supremacists. You hate people. Go away. Mark Dayton told them to leave the state if they don't like to have more refugees in their community. That's not how government is supposed to treat people. If people have legitimate concerns, and they did have legitimate concerns, they still do, then government should listen to them and try to get them the answers. And maybe we measure and decide that, yeah, the benefits outweigh the costs. That's very possible. But we don't know what the costs are. And what we do know is that with respect to more recent refugee communities, particularly the Somali community, many of them are not achieving the American dream. The unemployment rate amongst Somali men is about 5 or 6 or 7 times higher than the statewide rate. To me, we got to figure out why that is. I don't know the answer to that question. But why aren't they achieving the American dream? And rather than saying, let's just keep doing it, rather than stepping back and saying, let's figure this out to make sure this is working and that it's good for Minnesota, which we might decide, let's step back and do that, because I think that's how government should respond to people who have legitimate concerns, rather than calling them horrible names.
Well, we are a nation of immigrants. I stand here as a great-grandson of an immigrant from Germany. Worked a meatpacking plant. My father was the first to go to college using the GI Bill after his time in the Korean War. And now this is my American dream. This has happened throughout our history. Be very clear about this. America and Minnesota is better because of immigration. We are stronger because of immigration. And this issue, again, this goes to the heart of who we are. It goes to the heart of who we are of trying to fix this. The federal immigration system is broken. That's why we needed comprehensive immigration reform. It passed with 77 votes in the Senate. It was never heard in the United States Congress. This would have done things to make sure that we're spending our dollars wisely on border security. I spent 24 years in the military defending this nation. I've been to the border on numerous occasions to see what we need to do to make it right. We need to make sure drugs and those who want to hurt us. But we also recognize we need to create a path that is simple, is easier. We know who's coming so that folks can come here, get jobs that we need to, work hard, live the American dream, maybe save up a little extra money to buy a nice dress to go to services on Sunday, the things that we all like to do. And that strength comes from being a welcoming state and understanding this. It doesn't come from fear-mongering. It doesn't come from misplacing where the responsibility for immigration is at. It comes from this understanding that we come together and make those differences. And I will tell you, even if that is not enough, we are an aging population demographically. I am a geographer, demographer by training. 70% of the workforce in this state in the next 25 years is going to come from communities of color. We cannot afford to allow a single child to slip through the cracks in our public schools, and we need to make sure that this is a state that people choose to come to and that they participate and they pay their taxes and they send their kids to school and they create jobs like we're seeing in a vibrant Somali communities up and down this state, creating numerous opportunities. And whether it's here in Wilmer or whether it's in Worthington, we don't have any open storefronts in Worthington, but we sure have a lot of immigrant entrepreneurs filling those storefronts and making jobs. That's what we can do together. That's what Minnesota is.
So, Blois, I don't know if you were going to follow up on this or not, but I will. But I will just point out, make sure that we are making a distinction between the federal refugee resettlement program and legal immigration. They are very different things. I'm a great-grandson of an immigrant, as is my wife, and I couldn't agree more that immigration has made Minnesota better. And I think over the years, the refugee resettlement program has made Minnesota better. It's just not working right now, and we should try to figure that out rather than demonizing people. But we can't ignore the issue of illegal immigration, because that's a really important part of this equation as well. And we have very diametrically opposed issues here. I believe that Minnesota should cooperate with the federal government to enforce our immigration laws. And Tim Walz says we should be a sanctuary state, the only one in the upper Midwest, which means that we will be the safe space for any illegal immigrant who wants to come here. And they will come here, and I don't think that's a good thing for Minnesota.
Again, using loaded terms to drive Minnesotans apart is not going to get us closer to solutions. It's not a one Minnesota. Be very clear about this. It's very clear constitutionally. The responsibility for immigration reform lies with the federal government. What we know is that when community policing, and by the way, becoming more expensive to do community policing because we cut LGA, and the pressure on law enforcement, who, by the way, takes my position on this, that if you, and in communities where people feel the trust to go to the police when crimes are being committed while they are still trying to work on their status, they are more apt to go. In those communities, crime is lower. Statistically, that is factual. If your house is being burglarized by someone and your neighbor sees it and they're concerned about their immigration status alone and they're following law in every other manner, they are disincentivized from cooperating with the police, and we end up with crime rates accelerating. So this is not about following the law. This is not about allowing, I take great offense to this, that my children live here, your children live here, and these communities commit crimes at a lower rate than people who were born here. And to try and make a demonization against them and to try and say we don't care is never going to find us a solution. And if you have the police doing this, and it's what they do all the time, they're not going to be doing their other jobs, and it never gets at the root cause that we need comprehensive immigration reform that provides a legal, safe path for people to come here, which all of you know our economies are dependent on. So again, this does nothing but stoke fear. These communities then feel under assault, and I hear it every day that they do, and it doesn't need to be this way. We are the people who had this same issue 100, 200 years ago. We can work this out together, but it doesn't help if we're trying to throw out charged terms that people think that means something. And the idea of someone who's spent an entire lifetime following and trying to do what's right, that I would not care, is simply false. It's a mischaracterization, but that's how we get to the point of a divided Minnesota. That's how we get to a point where nothing's getting done. If you want to see this solved, and you want to improve the immigration system, and you want to make sure your neighbors feel safe, and you want our economy to grow, let's do it together. That's what I'm proposing.
Let's do this. Let's give Commissioner Johnson one last 30 seconds on this, then we have to move to another topic.
Well, to say that sanctuary state is a charged term is kind of odd because you've used it. You used it all through the primary to say that that's what you want. And make no mistake, don't let him confuse you on this. This is not about whether we force our police to enforce the immigration laws. Nobody wants them to do that. I will not allow them to do that. It's not their job. This is about whether we cooperate with the federal government or whether we refuse to cooperate with the federal government and create a sanctuary for any illegal immigrant who wants to come here. You're trying to confuse the issue, but it's a pretty straightforward thing. And I don't think most Minnesotans want this. And this argument that you have lower crime in a sanctuary state, Minneapolis is a sanctuary city. I'm guessing Mankato isn't. I bet crime is a heck of a lot higher in Minneapolis. So I don't quite understand that argument.
Sometimes population increases has something to do with that.
Per capita? No.
Okay.
Let's
move on.
Let's do this.
Per capita, it's not even close.
Okay,
move on.
let's jump in here. Remind the radio audience you are listening to Jeff Johnson and Tim Walz, the two top contenders to be the next governor of the state of Minnesota. My name is Chad Hartman, along with Blois Olson. We're at 8:06. We have, in theory, 24 more minutes. We might go a little bit over. Let me ask two different questions to each candidate here. And Congressman, I will start with you first. Your opponent raised Education Minnesota before. And he raised the idea that no matter what, you say yes to Education Minnesota. And you talk back about yourself as a teacher, and your kids are taught by those teachers right now. But I know you don't agree 100% with Education Minnesota. Give me a specific area where, as governor, where Education Minnesota may not like it. They may feel like we supported you, we were with you, but you're going to say, I'm sorry, I am disagreeing with you on a significant issue involving Education Minnesota.
Yeah, for all of you who don't know, I come from a family of teachers. I spent 20 years teaching. I started my career teaching in a Bureau of Indian Education School at Pine Ridge. And then I taught for several years in the People's Republic of China. I taught American history as the first group of American high school teachers. They taught us Chinese and dropped in, and we taught American history, the first group able to do that. I came back and met my wife while I was teaching in a little school right on the Nebraska-Wyoming border. And when we looked at states where we wanted to raise our children and where we wanted to teach, there was no question. It was Minnesota. It's my wife's home state from Ivanhoe, Minnesota, and we understood that investment that was there. We understood that the profession had been lifted up. So the issue of what we do collectively bargain, again, is made this giant boogeyman. It is not the union. It is a group of teachers who come together to collectively bargain to improve our profession, to make sure we get better student achievement. That is what we do together. And so we're not going to agree on all things. I would bring up this issue of classroom sizes. I think classroom size, if we attack the achievement gap at a younger age, it makes really great sense for me that we make sure we're targeting and having smaller class sizes at elementary levels. If we close that achievement gap, we can have larger classes in the high school. That is a bit of a contentious issue that comes up amongst that because of the fairness of it. I think the newer research that we're getting shows, again, when I was teaching, I had about a 14-year reading spread with my 11th grade geography students, meaning I had some at the second grade level and I had some at postgraduate. We know by research that we can close that gap early. If that would have been down to 6 or 7 years of gap, I could have taught more students and got the same outcome. So that is a difference that we have. It's one that I want to talk about with them, about a blanket statement of class sizes instead of targeting it more to those classes where I think we can make a bigger impact.
But respectively, would you say that's a significant difference with
That's a pretty
Education
big
Minnesota
difference.
by advocating making schools smaller?
It's scope of practice issue amongst that we collectively bargain together. And again, whether you agree this or not, I feel strongly that the right to collectively bargain help build the middle class. It's a fairness. It is a freedom that we have and one that we need to protect. And when we bargain together, it means that we have to give a little bit to come together and have that. This one's fairly significant because if you're a secondary teacher and you're an elementary teacher, this class size issue can be a little bit there. And I think you're asking me that. I agree in many cases because Education Minnesota is to provide the highest quality teachers and the greatest outcomes. I'm not going to disagree with much of that and the way we do it, especially with professional educators who've done this their whole life.
All right, Jeff, let me ask you. You are someone who has stated many times that we are an overtaxed state. And we don't expect you, if you should win, to continue many of the ideas of Mark Dayton on the tax side. We have also witnessed at the state level, Tim Pawlenty, who said, no new taxes. We watched George H.W. Bush say no new taxes, and both ended up going back on that, including Governor Pawlenty when he tried fees.
Yep.
Are you an absolutist right now? Are you telling us that if you win, there will absolutely be no tax increases while you're the governor? Or are you willing to say, this is an area, and you can tell me what that is, where we do need to raise more revenue, and we can reach out through taxes because it does matter to citizens of this state?
Yeah, what I have always said is that I will not support an increase to the overall tax burden when I'm governor. And that is an absolute for me. I will not. We are so overtaxed in this state, it's insane. And so I have no trouble with that. That doesn't mean that you might not move things around. That doesn't mean that as you look at, if you're looking at tax reform, comprehensive tax reform, you might say it makes a little more sense for this one to be higher but this one to be lower to offset it. But yes, I can very confidently say that the overall tax burden in this state will not increase when I'm governor.
So if the state faces unexpected financial burdens, they happen. We are in a great economic run right now.
Yep.
But if that would happen during, let's just say, your first term, you will still say that no matter what, the overall state tax burden will not go up.
That is correct. And we have seen, just to remind you, a 53% increase in spending in 8 years. So it's not like we've all of a sudden cut to the bone. We also have a rainy day fund that is full and should be full, and my goal will be to keep it full. And we've seen massive tax increases the last 8 years. And let me point out two. One of them is the Social Security tax, the tax on Social Security benefits for seniors. We are one of the few states in America that still taxes any portion of that, and that's money that's already been taxed. And so one of my goals will be probably over time to eliminate that in Minnesota like most states do. But the bigger one to me is the income tax because it affects all people who are working in this state, or almost all people who are working in this state. And the governor and DFL legislator created a new fourth tier that is completely out of whack with the rest of the country. And that's a problem because it drives away wealth and investment. We've seen that. My bigger problem, though, is it's not with that high tier. It's with our bottom tier. Our bottom income tax tier in Minnesota, which applies to anyone who's making more than $10,300 a year, so almost everybody. That bottom income tax tier is higher than the highest tier in 23 other states. That is insane. Think about that for a minute. What that tells me is that we're not just taxing to death CEOs in Minnesota. We're taxing to death school teachers and bartenders and mechanics and child care providers and every struggling small business owner in this state. And the argument that taxes aren't high enough or if something changes, that's where we have to go. I just don't buy into that.
Okay. We're going to move on to education and property taxes. There's a big difference between property taxes in greater Minnesota and in the metro areas, specifically how they fund our schools. What specifically would you work on as Governor, Jeff, that would change that formula and change the burden on greater Minnesota while still providing the same amount of funding?
Change the K-12 funding formula or change
property tax formula?
Okay. Thank you. Well, one thing that I have seen in the legislature the last few years, which I would support, is an extension of the home, garage, and 1 acre from only dealing with, I can't remember if it's operating referenda or the other, but making it consistent across the board. Because if it's good for one, it should be good for the other. I think that's something that would be of great help to property owners, particularly farmers in greater Minnesota. I also believe, and this is broader, it's not just about greater Minnesota, it's about Minnesotans in general, but there are several states that have property tax increase caps that say you can't, as an individual, it's not an overall property tax cap that says, the county can't raise your property taxes more than 3%. What it says is for any individual, the property tax on their homestead that has nothing to do with improvements that they made can't increase over a certain percent. Maybe it's 2%, maybe it's 4%. So that there is predictability for individuals as to what their tax might be in the next year. And I think that's something we should absolutely consider.
Congressman?
Minnesota's prosperity when it exploded in the 1970s was tied to two pretty important things. It was shared prosperity, by the way. LGA and equalization of school funding formulas. And over the years, the movement away from LGA and the burden placed on property taxes, especially as communities got smaller and it tended to be agricultural land. And as we saw communities get denser in the Twin Cities and the suburbs. So now we have a situation where we're forcing schools to be dependent on operating levy referendums, which are tax increases that you do, but oh no, not the governor, not the legislature. That's on you. That's the one you to do. What it ended up doing is now we have a situation where we have rural schools holding bonding referendums to fix leaky roofs. And we have suburban school districts holding bond referendums to build the third domed turf stadium and add Chinese to the French classes. So the equal of making sure greater Minnesota prospers in this is going back to an equalization of that funding formula and having an honest conversation with Minnesotans about keeping pace with inflation is not a tax increase. It is simply the budgeting that all of us live by. And as we fall further and further behind and the burden gets shifted more to rural schools, then we see an outflux of folks trying to go elsewhere, and we lose the growth and we lose the capacity, we lose the identity, and in the long run, we lose the ability to create the workforce. If we're looking at the 21st century, I went to the University of Minnesota yesterday, and we had the Minnesota Cup. It was all our great entrepreneurs competing like a Shark Tank type thing where they won $80,000. And these folks were saying they were coming from California, they're coming from New York because of the lifestyle that we have. And many of them said they would choose to go into greater Minnesota, but the lack of broadband access, the lack of the public schools being able to compete and offer. We only have 1,000 kids in the state that take advanced placement computer science classes. We need to expand on that. So this issue of equalization, changing the funding formula, keeping pace for inflation, and again, coming back to the case again. If the state, and we're not seeing this as one Minnesota in a shared transparency or a shared growth together, we're going to end up with a situation of communities that can no longer afford their local schools, a consolidation back to them, a loss of job growth, and we're going to see the gutting, which is the very thing people want to live in. I choose to live in Mankato, and Mankato is not a failed Twin Cities. It is Mankato, just like Medelia is not a failed Mankato. It is a different lifestyle that is predicated on making sure our children have access to that high-quality education. And so I would ensure that we move back to that system of equalization. We take the pressure off and see us together, and all of us know where all the people are and all the activity is and all the property is. There's a lot of tax dollars generated there. So the Twin Cities area sends 67% of the tax dollars out to greater Minnesota. But just like a bridge that we build in southern Minnesota for those 15 families, we feed and create economic growth. That's what this needs to be, and that's how we fund our schools.
Okay, let me
Can I
remind folks.
Can I agree with him on something?
That would be fine.
Cool. We're actually in the same place on equalization as somebody who grew up in Detroit Lakes. And again, my wife's parents are both lifelong public school teachers. That has been something that has made Minnesota's K-12 funding work better than a lot of states do. And while we still have it, it's certainly there. I think there are things we could do to enhance that. So I would say I'm on the same page, just as a happy note.
All right, stop that. We want differences. We're going to get to two last questions, closing statements, and then Blois is going to buy us food everywhere we want to go later. Tariffs, and I will start with you, Commissioner Johnson. I believe we've talked about this before on the radio. I think this is one area where you and the President don't agree on tariffs. It's clear what the President believes is he feels like many countries, including China, have been taking advantage of the United States for a long, long time. He is a negotiator. He wants to stand up. He has been aggressive with tariffs. He has also come up with federal legislation to help out farmers. But it's very clear he's trying to play the long game, trying to play that the United States economy is significantly bigger than China and that they will buckle, that we will win, and the farmers in the long run will be better. I know this is mainly a federal issue, but if you win, and we're thinking greater Minnesota, we think a lot about farmers. It's many more jobs than that, but farmers drive a great deal of our economy. If you are the governor, will you do anything in particular if the tariffs are still going and that issue has not been resolved in favor of the farmers to help them out in this state?
Well, I don't know specifically what I would do if that's the question, whether you're talking about some sort of aid package. And I'm going to be honest, I don't promise the sun to everybody. And so it certainly is something as we look at that first budget, if it's absolutely necessary, we'll consider that as an option. But, I mean, you bring up a good point and kind of a difficult issue. I'm a free trade guy. And so I do differ with the President on the particular issue of tariffs. I think in general, they're bad. We have gotten a raw deal from China, though. There's no two ways about that. And with respect to NAFTA, he did seem to bring us to an improved place, at least according to many of the farmers that I've talked to. So, you know, maybe that long game is producing some positive results, but overall, the use of tariffs is just not a good thing, I don't think, for the state of Minnesota. And what I can do probably more than anything else is be an advocate with the administration to let them know how it's affecting Minnesota.
Congressman, is that enough if you're the governor to be an advocate and you leave this just to the federal level, or should the governor step in?
Did you ask Thursday if he'd take them off?
I'm sorry?
Did you ask on Thursday night if he would take them off or help us?
I did not. We talked for 2 minutes.
Okay. Well, here's the thing about this. Trade is complex. Trade is complex for all of us because we need to make sure we're getting fair deals. And I think it is fair to say for all of us, some trade deals are better than others. They're not all created equal. And when we get deals, there's give and takes. We've lost manufacturing jobs that went overseas. Certainly in Minnesota, most of our trade deals, I think, have been incredibly positive towards agriculture because our producers have done a wonderful job through their checkouts and through their checkoffs and their advocacy creating these markets. It's hard. It's hard to get markets. And once you get them, you want to hold them. So this is going to have, no one's disputing that we need to get a fair deal. But our farmers were put at the heart of this. Our farmers were then told that there would be tax dollars coming to them because of the $1 trillion trade deficit we had last year or the national deficit. We borrowed that money from China to pay our farmers to not sell beans to China that would have gave us money to reduce the debt. That makes no sense. And when people tell us to have patience, we're doing this. We want to be patient. We are patriotic people. But here's what I would do as governor. One of the things that is clear to me is we're going to continue to see a lot of this dysfunction. We're going to see some of this disruptions. I think what we can do in a business that has so many variables, weather, flooding, all of the things that come out of this that are happening, the one thing we need is certainty in how we deliver services. So here's what I would do. I would continue our investments in agricultural research at the University of Minnesota. I would continue to work with the checkoffs with our soybean growers, our corn growers, to find new markets and new products that they could do. I would, as I said earlier, advocate for the expansion of B20 and new markets that would go, expand that out. I would look for us to diversify our products so that we can find new markets elsewhere that we might already be maxed out with in those commodities. Those are all things that we can do. And you know what we can do? And we just saw Governor Dayton and his team do this. We can set up and negotiate some of these trade deals like we saw a good deal with Taiwan here recently. Those are things that we can do. And I would commit to setting up those permanent offices, making sure that we have those connections so that when we have situations like this, we don't lose those hard-fought markets. We continue to innovate and add the value added, because in a trade war, the very people who have always created wealth, who have always kept the trade imbalance coming, at least moving our way, should not pay the penalty for areas. This is where we need to be more strategic, and as governor, I will do everything that a state level can to innovate, create markets, and hold us as harmless as we can. But it is still going to be the negotiation with the federal government to fix the long-term tariff issue.
Okay. Last question before closing statements. There are three key issues that are raised very regularly in Greater Minnesota when it comes to economic development. They are broadband, childcare, and housing. All of them have connection to each other and jobs and the economy of Greater Minnesota. How do you address those three if you're governor?
In the next hour?
No, that's why I saved it till last, because I knew we could,
Yes.
be concise.
Yes, this is core. This is core to holding us back on development. And once again, there are both private sector solutions, and then there's going to be the idea of where government can make some difference. And on the issue of broadband, this is absolutely now a necessity. This is like when we did rural electrification. And the state is moving ahead, and we're a model in many ways. But if you're out here and your kids got to drive into the Perkins to get Wi-Fi to do their homework, we're putting them behind. That cannot go on. So we proposed an aggressive plan to start moving towards making sure that we're connected, making sure we get those speeds on the not where we think they should be in 2025, but where they should be going forward from that. So the broadband piece, and that plays into healthcare costs, because we can reduce the cost using telemedicine on many things. We integrate healthcare records to save costs that reduce overhead. All of those things play into that. The issue of childcare, we have folks that can't take jobs because of childcare is too expensive. It's too hard to get. The people aren't reimbursed the way they should be, or the distance to try and get there. There are innovative solutions. In Harmony, Minnesota, we have a major manufacturing plant down there, and with some help between state, federal, and their innovation, we did something that I think is a wonderful model. They took a building adjacent to them, and they converted it in for their employees, and they're using it as a recruiting tool, and they filled all of their positions by advertising. One of the benefits is high-quality childcare where you can go have lunch with your kids, or you don't. If they see them too often, you can skip doing that. But they're there if you want to see them. And then the housing piece is complex. But let me bring it in before we get to this affordable housing, to make sure folks want to move there and we can hire folks, make sure they got a place where they can put their kids, and that businesses can, just like those entrepreneurs I saw at the University of Minnesota, can start there. This is going to take an innovative solution. And I would ask all of you, Jeff has talked about our website, go there, check some of this out, because there is a One Minnesota Community Prosperity Plan that we're doing that deals with grants to local communities, that allows them, by using and leveraging state, federal, and local money, to attack some of these in a way that make much more sense. This proposal we rolled out to mayors across the state, and we have city councils that signed resolutions that they want this done from Fergus Falls to Austin, because it would attack these issues, because in many cases it's a multiple approach to all three of these things. It makes sense to leverage what we can do statewide, federally, and the private sector. And that piece, if these infrastructure pieces are not there, there's no growth. And just to be clear, the two top issues are the child care and the housing issue is also a problem in the metro area. This isn't Greater versus the Twin Cities. It is there. The advantage they do have is, and the advantage the hub cities have, is broadband access, and that is creating inequities and lost opportunities. So I think it is going to be, again, what I believe, and I've come back this entire day, the theme of is the solutions are out there. You're not going to hear it and be dictated from who the governor is, but you're going to need a leader who has the capacity to align those interests, to bring people together. So I put out a plan before the election, sent it out to the mayors, the city councils looked at it, and they voted on resolutions to say, this is what we want to do before the election. That's how you work together. After you get elected and say, I'll come up with an idea, is a little too late. So these solutions are out there, and they're out there with Minnesotans.
Commissioner Johnson.
So actually, two of these problems are partially created by government. The one that isn't is broadband, and I'm not a believer generally that government should compete in the private marketplace, but we do have programs that are pretty successful, or a program that's pretty successful that provides incentives to the private sector to step up where the need is, and I certainly will support continuing that because I talk a lot about competing better with the states that surround us. We don't compete very well from a business if you're not connected. With respect to housing, again, I'm not a believer that government should be spending a ton of money to own housing, but there are many innovative programs out there, grant programs that help the market meet the demand where there is greater demand. We're actually doing some really amazing and impressive things in Hennepin County that I actually agree with on housing. One of them is called Naturally Occurring Affordable Housing, and well, I won't go into detail, but it's a good program, and it's something that we could expand to the state level. There is, however, a government element here, because there was a study just recently done that showed that if you build the identical house on one side of the border in Minnesota and the other, whether you're looking at Wisconsin, Iowa, or either of the Dakotas, the identical house is considerably more expensive in Minnesota, partly because of our code requirements and regulations. So maybe we should take a look at that and see if government is actually making affordable housing less likely. And then with respect to child care, we actually have a nation-leading system where we have that sliding fee scale for people who need it, who need help, because it's very expensive. We went through that twice with our two boys. But here is where government really, truly is causing a big piece of the problem. We've lost, what is it? I think it's 16,000. We've lost 16,000 child care providers in the last 10 years in greater Minnesota. I've talked to a big chunk of them. I probably talked to 25 or 30 of them over the last year and a half, including my sister, by the way, who's had an in-home child care center for 31 years in Detroit Lakes. And those that are going out of business, it's not because they don't like what they're doing. It's not because they don't love the kids. It's not even because they can't always make a little bit of money, even though their margins are small. They're doing it because government is regulating them out of business. And the horror stories I have heard about the attitude of some of the people in the Department of Human Services, and in some cases the county, that has forced them out of business, that's a big part of the problem. And so we have to change that attitude. And, if government is part of the problem, let's actually make government the solution instead of part of the problem. We see a lot of that.
Okay. We're going to move to closing statements, but before we do, I want to thank our hosts here at the Midwest Technology Campus in Wilmer, Ag Country for the refreshments, AgriGrowth, the Minnesota Corn Growers, AARP, and Minnesota Credit Unions. Thank you for hosting us. Each candidate now has 2 minutes for their closing statements. Commissioner Johnson, you'll go first.
Thank you. Well, thank you, guys. Thank you as well to the hosts. This has been a great event tonight. Thank you to Tim. Thank you for coming out to kick the tires tonight. We got 4 weeks left in this campaign. I believe Minnesota is the greatest state in America to live. It has been my entire life, and I've lived 46 of my 51 years here. But I do have concerns about the direction government has been taking Minnesota, particularly the last 8 years, and maybe just a little bit longer than that. And where we go from here as government, I think, will really determine the greatness of Minnesota going forward. And Tim and I just have very different views about where we go from here. I believe that Minnesotans are overtaxed, and Tim has promised to raise taxes. I believe that Minnesotans should have more control over their health care and more options in their health insurance, and Tim believes government should control our health care. I believe that we should cooperate with the federal government to enforce our immigration laws, and Tim believes we should be a sanctuary state. I believe that our Second Amendment rights are absolutely critical to our liberty and our freedom in this state, and Tim touts his F from the NRA as a badge of honor. And I could keep going, and I won't tell them that you're going to steal their puppies, Tim.
That was the last one. I'm going to take your puppies.
But I just suffice it to say this. Rather than more of the same, rather than a third Mark Dayton term, a few steps to the left, I believe we need just a fundamental change in the status quo in Minnesota. where we are holding our government accountable again to taxpayers, where we are demanding that our state employees are actually serving us rather than trying to control us all the time, and where we are lifting up, where we are promoting, empowering, not government, not the bureaucracy, not the politically well-connected, but our amazing, hardworking people in this state. And if we can change that attitude, if we can make those changes, then I truly believe Minnesota's days are only going to be better going forward. So thank you for being here, and I hope to earn your support. Thanks.
Chad and Blois, thank you. To our sponsors, thank you. And to each of you and to the listeners out there.